Okay, so my players have only done one more session now before we're caught up, and we're again not meeting right now. So, but before I get into where they ended, I did mention in the last video that I was going to talk about how I handle critical failures and critical hits, and how mine is, I think it's a house rule. I'm fairly certain they haven't defined it this way in the player's handbook or the dungeon master's guide or whatever. But I've been doing it for so long now and all of my players are so used to having it function that way, and they all like the flavor that it provides. So usually if somebody rolls a critical miss, a 1, I always have them re-roll it. And my rule is that if they roll low again, so like if they roll between like 2 and 5 again, then they just miss, and that's life. They don't hit one of their companions or anything like that with a hit. We're talking about combat here. If they roll a 1-1, they automatically damage themselves in some way. So it could be that they drop their weapon depending on what they're doing. It could be like if the spell was to roll, say like a wisdom check or something like that, because it was some sort of mental confusion, that would backfire and it would go on them and they have to roll the check, or they damage themselves. So 1-1 means you're hurting yourself. If they do a 1 and they roll pretty good, like 15 or up to 19, then they are going to be hitting somebody in front of them, as long as it's not the target they were trying to hit. Most of the time it's going to be an ally, but usually I'll count how many people are on the board. So if they have 4 targets that are an option on that, I'll roll a d4 and that determines who they hit in the back, basically. So that's a 1 high-ish. And then a 120 means that they crit damage on somebody they were not trying to hit, or something they were not trying to hit. And that's essentially what I do for combat. It adds an extra element of risk, flavor, pizzazz in combat, and I like that. The thing that I do, skill checks are a little bit different. You can't really critical fail or critical succeed a skill check, and that's because depending on what you're doing, the difficulty is the same. So say you're trying to unlock a door and the door has been put in place or locked by somebody really, really powerful. Maybe the check is 30. They're just really not supposed to get in there. Critical success on that still might not get you in that door because it wouldn't be matching up to 30, right? So I don't use the criticals as firmly, I guess. It's just another roll. Now, 1s are a little bit different, especially when it comes to persuasion and things like that. So if they roll a critical 1, the person might become slightly unfriendly to that person. So you can mess around a little bit more with 1s, but 20s, maybe they'll gain a little bit more information, but it shouldn't be a drastic difference, essentially. But I rule things happen in combat and a little bit less out of combat skills. So our players were just getting out of the forest, that's right. And they got back to, and Professor Sprout asked them to deliver the moss that they had collected to the hospital wing. I kind of wanted them to get over to the hospital wing in order to see what was going on with the bed bugs. I just wanted to kind of alleviate their hatred of the task. It didn't work. So, I mean, that's fine. They went and they delivered. So they were considering pocketing some of it. They wanted to keep some for themselves, but they ended up giving it, maybe most of it, I think, to Professor Sprout. The potions professional, as it were, probably kept, I think, a smidgen for her own stores, but they gave most of it to, not Professor Sprout, Pomfrey, and I'm Pomfrey, the hospital nurse, doctor. So when they went there, they did find a bunch of people that had a bunch of bug bites all over their face, or bird bites, pest bites, I should say. They had been helping out in Hagrid's patch, so they can kind of see like what happened to the people that did that task since they didn't choose it. And the moss was being used to help them. So they were like, oh, okay, we should definitely give up the moss. That night, they slept, but they did want to try to sneak out. One of my players was like, I just don't get why we are going through the secret passageway from Slytherin to the ballroom. Like, that doesn't make any sense. It's such a short distance, right? They're going from here up here. That's what the secret passage essentially does. It doesn't actually travel very far. My players were like, this doesn't make any sense. Why are we doing this? Let's just go out the portrait. So they tried that. And I've of course just been waiting for them to do this because they've been talking about doing it for a few sessions now. So they snuck out here, went around the corner, and guess who is waiting for them at the end of the corridor? Their prefect Lena, who is now suspicious of them all of the time after they were talking about wanting to sneak out of secret corridors way back in the beginning. So she's got her eye on them like a hawk for the rest of the game. And I hope that they're now prepared. But now she's catching them a second time, sneaking out after curfew. And she tells them to immediately march back down the hall and go to their common room. They tried to pull it off, like the professor up here has given them permission to get out, and she asked if they had some sort of slip saying so, and they didn't, of course. So they marched back down, and then she cast Kalushu all over the portrait. She's a high-level student, so it's very sticky, and it won't be opening anytime soon. After curfew, so they can't get out the portrait hole anymore. So they all decided to go to bed because they got caught again. In the morning, they decided that they wanted to go to the tower. They did remember that one of the portraits, this guy, is basically, afraid of heights. He constantly fell off places. That's how he died. And so they were like, well, let's go to one of the tallest towers in the game, which was the bell tower. And they went over there, but on their way, they finally discovered another secret passageway. They were being very good and rolling skill checks as they were traveling up the tower, checking things, making sure they didn't miss anything. I was very proud of them. And they discovered, I don't remember which stairwell or like level I decided to put it on. Probably third would make the most sense. But the secret passageway was underneath one of the stairs, and so they found that. But they really wanted to get to the top of the tower, so they made a mental note. They rolled history checks to make sure that they didn't miss it or forget it. They put the stair back in place, and they kept going up to get to the top of the tower. In the top tower, they met Kalida. Now, I don't really know where I'm, going with Kalida. She kind of struck me. Oh, that's not it. Bell tower, here we go. She kind of struck me as interesting one night while I was kind of mentally planning before going to bed. I just really like the concept of there being a time where the sorting hat wasn't able to sort somebody. Like, what would that look like, and why wouldn't they be able to sort her? And how does she kind of deal with the I don't know how to make that into a word. Being ostracized. Okay. Talking is hard. But yeah. So I put generic black robes on her. She kind of tells them their story. They talk with her about her owl. The story behind Dido is actually really interesting. So I did some research, quite a bit of research on owls and like their lore and their history in our world. And turns out that North America likes owls. We like kind of consider them wise, kind of representing wisdom. But everywhere else thinks that they're just harbingers of death and that they're scary. So I was very excited to put that in about the bad lore of owls, especially because I'm using them to guide people to the afterlife. It just fits so perfectly. So I was very excited. I wanted to put her in there, even though I don't really know where I'm going to go. I don't know if I wanted her to be a villain. If I want her to be like undead, I don't know how I could pull that off. But I'm excited to kind of play with her a little bit more, even though I haven't decided what's up with her. So they talked to her a little bit. They gained some information about owls. One of them can talk to animals, ask yes or no questions with the Comprendo spell. And they talked to Dido specifically and, learned that it doesn't like guiding the dead and it tries to avoid the owlry and things like that, and that there are dead like souls floating around the owlry. So they gained some information from her, and then she ends up leaving because she's got something else to do. And the players are looking around for the picture of Sir Clifton Wrightingham. They climbed up into a loft and they found that somebody's been sleeping in the loft. Most of the stuff that I have right now, Kalita was pre-planned, but this, like, while they're exploring, I just kind of threw stuff in there. Oh, so somebody's been sleeping in the loft. I kind of imagined that it was Filch, who would kind of go up there to get away from students because he gets really sick of them, and they can always kind of find him in his office. His office isn't very secluded, I guess, and he can always hear them outside. So this is his, like, kind of getaways where he tries to get away from students. So there's like a little nook where he can take naps in, and he keeps a little keepsake box up there, which they were very excited. They found a treasure chest, essentially, and they wanted to get inside the keepsake box. They, of course, didn't know that it was Filch that I had put up there, this is his little secret nook. But that's kind of how I imagined it was. And some of the players played with the treasure box, the keepsake box. Some players went and tried to like climb on the bell. Another player went, one of the players, once they realized they were going to have to climb so many steps up the tower, my player that's really good at flying went to go get her broom. And she flew up to the top of the tower here, because they're at the 6th floor. That's a lot of walking. But it was great. It was a great opportunity for me to introduce her to more owly things. So there is an owl that's basically Voldemort's owl. And that owl is the one that is basically guiding the professor of the dark arts teacher's essence to the golden tree in the Forbidden Forest. So my player that's good at flying sees this owl. It seems really out of place, and it's kind of like flying around Hogwarts. And she follows it. And it parks. Yes. So she flew around here, and it has a tiny little nook. in the outside of the castle. Now, if you guys remember, in my last group, I had to move this owl and this little bonsai tree thing into the defense against the dark arts professors. Ugh, such a mouthful. DA's office. I had to move that stuff inside the office, even though it was so obvious and people would have noticed it, because I needed them to find it. But now, with my home group, I got to put it where I wanted, which is below the window of the office on the outside. So there's like this little nook this owl lives in on the outside of the castle. And my player flew around and found the owl, and the owl like hooted, and it was being all cute because owls are, to be honest, kind of cute. And it like went inside this little hole, and she reached her hand inside the hole to see what was in. She felt the tree, so she knows that there's like this weird tree thing in potting soil. And then she left, a little confused why this owl's being this and doing these weird things. But then she went up to the 6th floor. So I dropped a really big hint, and I'm very excited I was able to do it this week, because now I want them to like kind of start connecting the puzzle pieces and how all these things are connected, because there's just so many. Okay, so she flew up to the bell tower, and since she had her broom, she went up to the roof, which is technically on the 7th floor. This is the roof. And she finds the painting on top of the roof, and it's like Kalushu'd there basically with the spell glue. A Kalushu is a spell that they can buy or own. But so they have to find a way to get it off of the roof. So they remembered in the forest that there was some sort of sticky substance they ran into, and they were able to get it off by walking in the water. So they were like, well, maybe it's water soluble. And they went to the kitchens, talked to the house elves there, and they got cups of water, and they brought up, and they got the painting. So yay, they found another painting. They were very excited. And down in where they're playing with this little keepsake box, of course the box has traps on it, and my rogue player is not the most savvy at being a rogue. You know, when people select a class that they're really excited to play, but they also don't really know how to play it, and they don't really get the fact that you're supposed to be sneaky and you're supposed to check things. And anyways, so she didn't check things, or maybe she rolled bad, I don't know. But she opened the keepsake box. They ended up getting it open, and there was a trap in there, and she got put to sleep. She rolled really bad on her constitution, and she's basically asleep for an indefinite amount of time. Now, that's not very fun for the player, so obviously there are ways that my players can wake her up, because I don't want her just sitting there twiddling her thumbs for the rest of the night. That'd be no fun. But there was a consequence for not checking the box. So my players ended up like looking through the box, and they kept trying to find ways of like waking up the player that fell asleep. They were like dragging her around, and inside the keepsake box there was no treasures. There was just a bunch of old photos. Now I was thinking that these would be photos of people that impacted Filch throughout his life. I mean, he's a really old dude, and he would have, I think, a lot of friends. Like, how did he meet Dumbledore? Why did Dumbledore hire him? And like, was he part of a little group or startup group here at Hogwarts? And that's why he was put on staff. Maybe he was friends with some professors that are no longer there at some point. So that's what I imagined would be in his keepsake box, is like photos of people when he was younger and he had dreams, you know? Imagine Filch having dreams and being a squib just dashed them. It's just such a sad thing to think about, but also I think interesting to explore. So I wanted to put something in there about Filch. I kind of want to play with the idea that Dumbledore and a number of other people were trying really hard to solve the squib problem. And they built this place in the Forbidden Forest, some sort of, I don't know, fortress. Fortress is probably the wrong word. But structure in the Forbidden Forest to kind of do like experiments to see if they could find a cure for the squibism. I don't know. To reintroduce magic to people that have become squibs. So I kind of imagined that that's hiding in the Forbidden Forest, and it'd be super fun to explore like what kind of weird magic was done there. And anyways, that's a really big tangent, but I'm excited to see if I can put it in there and if my players want to keep going with the campaign. I got all these ideas, you guys. So I put these tiny little Easter eggs in there and hope I can expand them later on. That's what Kalita is. That is what this weird keepsake box is. They looked at all the pictures. They didn't recognize anybody, of course, because they're so much younger. But once they see Filch, if they see him walking around the hallways, I'm going to have them roll a history check to see if anything clicks. Like, oh my gosh, I saw that guy. It was in those pictures. So they all made sure to memorize the pictures. They again rolled history checks to make sure they could commit them to memory for certain ways. And I forget how they woke up their player. I felt like she was asleep for so long. But regardless, she ended up waking up. They put the keepsake box back. They didn't take any of the pictures or anything like that. And my flying player, Arturo, went and they wanted to give the picture back to Professor McGonagall. And it's a big picture. I get it. You can't lug it around. But she decided, they didn't want to make an appointment. That just takes too long. And they didn't want to go find Hagrid and get escorted up there. That just wasn't going to be something they did. They wanted to drop it off immediately. And to be honest, I don't blame them. I should have not made Professor McGonagall have appointments, but it makes sense. She's a busy lady. But so Arturo is her name. She's my flyer. She goes over to Professor McGonagall's office window and starts pounding on the window. Good news is her persuasion check was through the roof. And this is one of those circumstances where, because she rolled very high with her persuasion, McGonagall did make the window disappear, took the painting which she saw through the window, and then put the window back in. So they all laughed about it. It was funny. So they delivered their painting, and what did they do after that? I think that was the end. Oh no, they went back. Yeah, they went back to the secret passage that they had found in the tower underneath the steps, and they went down. It kind of tees, the secret passage does. It goes from, so I was saying library, 3rd floor, so West Tower here, and it connects to the ballroom. It connects to a window here. There's a illusion window, false window, whatever, here. And then it goes from here up to the library, like behind the wall here. So this, and it hadn't originally been that way, but they need to find secret passages that are useful to them, so they stopped trying to sneak out the stupid way. So they followed the passageway, and that led to the ballroom first. And in there they found, and now again, this wasn't planned, I just was throwing stuff in there for funsies. I mean, we also have alcohol while we're playing, as most people do if they're of age. And, you know, at that point, I'm just throwing out ideas as we're playing. What did I have them? I had them run into pixies, and the pixies were tending a swamp full of devil's snare. So now it's small. Pixies are small, so the swamp that they were tending was small. So, but I mean, it's still an extra dimension, I guess, arguably, in Hogwarts. But I mean, Room of Requirement can expand and contract in different ways, so can my pixie swamp. But yeah, they ran into them, and the pixies weren't initially hostile. They just didn't want them to step like on the devil's snare or near the devil's snare. Basically, they couldn't touch the water. But the pixies don't speak English. I had them speak gibberish, which I got to speak gibberish to my players and use a bunch of body language and facial expressions, which they had to try to interpret to see what it was the pixie was so upset about. That was pretty fun. We all had a blast doing it. They were able to get across the swamp without disturbing it, and the pixies didn't have to get hostile. Arturo still had her broom, so she just like flew people across the swamp area, and then they connected to the ballroom. I think that I thought maybe they ended there, but I know that they eventually went to the other side of the passage towards the library, so they went back through the swamp and past the West Tower again and into the library, because this fight was very difficult, which I was actually kind of surprised by it. I don't have the combat panel that I used for the Doxies. I just went and looked for like some sort of round Polony monster thing, I guess, and just used that. But so they went to this portion of the library. It was pretty small. The quarters were small, and I think that's what added to the difficulty, was they couldn't move around and they couldn't move out of the way. The monsters I had might have had a blasty thing too. But so they, of course, were interested. They were in some sort of closed off section of the library, and they're like, what kind of books would be closed off in here? So they pulled the cloth off, and the Doxies were in there. Now, Doxies, of course, are in the universe, and I was very excited to put them in and have them fight. Did not know that they were going to crush my players, though. So, but once they finished the combat, and they nursed their wounds, they started looking for books. Now, of course, this is every dungeon master's nightmare, is when they're in a library and you haven't typed up any book names at all. Unless you've been drinking, because then you can come up with all sorts of weird names, like magical creatures and the food they turn into. Because for some reason they were looking for cookbooks, which of course they would find cookbooks in here. Like, that is not a relevant topic probably for most young wizards in the area. So they found cookbooks and past constellations, because like who needs that? I don't know. And then why the architect of Hogwarts was a terrible person. That would probably be something they would want to not bring into the normal library. They also had a bunch of other books that I just don't remember giving them. I would have to go look. I like peruse my characters' notes. I just have to see what I give them that I can't remember. So I'll probably have to go look to see what other kind of books I gave them. I know I gave my potions, the person with potions, something about poisons, and I should definitely figure out what that says. And a history about Hogwarts, or a history about the Forbidden Forest, that one could be important. The problem was my brawler picked it up, and I did say that it was bigger than their textbook that they were currently using, and it was much better binded, and now they want to use it to hit things. Oh, it's over here. So, Brawler, they take their textbook and they slam things, and so they want to use this history of the Forbidden Forest to beat creatures. And I'm like, oh, but it has such important information. So maybe I shouldn't have done that, but that's what I gave them in the library. And then that's when they ended up going back. They did see where it like led to in the library, and it was definitely behind a bookshelf. So they poked some of the books off to kind of see where they were, but then they went back through the ballroom to finish up that weekend. Oh, before they ended up sleeping to go into the next week, which will be the third in-game week, one of my players talked to Vinda, who's, of course, the ghost professor. And she is going to be performing a ritual on Professor Binns. That's going to be happening in weekend 3 here. Ritual for Professor Binns. This is essentially going to allow players to track his essence and where it's going. So this is kind of like a final piece of information. This will directly lead them into the forest if they can find it. I'm not really sure if I want to make this as final or if I wanted to make it like a temporary thing. Good news is I have a ton of time to think about it and plan for it, right? Because we're all stuck inside. So I haven't exactly perfected what I want to happen with this ritual, but he talked to her, they made a time, and Vinda's actually going to go pick them up for the ritual. It has to happen at night after curfew. She's going to go retrieve them for it, because they've been helping figure out this whole thing. So that's what they have coming up during the weekend. So for their lectures this week, they had potions down here, and we talked about the Leeton berry. So Leeton, I guess, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong too because it's German. It's German for guidance or something similar to that. And I just put some lore attached to it that people were, baking the berry into pies, and then people were those people that were eating the pie kept having people follow them or animals follow them, spirits and ghosts. So I wanted to attach the idea that this berry helps the owls guide people, and it's called guidance berry, essentially. So they kind of learned that essential piece of information after they had found the berries. They also learned that the berries that were around the owlery, I put bushes around the owlery that were dead, and they did notice those, but they didn't know they were Leetonberry bushes until I think talking with Kalita in the West Tower and that her owl. So they ended up taking the potion, and a bunch of critters were following them around and poking at them and being cute as they went to their next lesson, which was charms. So they had a bunch of critters following them all over the place while they were in charms. They were gathering up underneath their desks. It was really funny. So they did charms. They learned a little bit more about how I've separated the spell categories and how I've classified things, again adding more made of detail to the world that wasn't there before. So this was kind of like a puzzle, or I guess closer to a skill challenge, and they learned a spell called Lego, which links two things. This was really important, again, to understand how the ritual was working. It's an unfinished ritual that is linking two different things, that tiny little bonsai tree that owl is hanging out is linked to the giant tree that is in the forest. So they're learning the spell that basically linked those two things. And then they're casting an enchantment to see if it affects the other object. So they had two objects. They had to cast an enchantment on one of them and link it to the other to see if it affects the other one. Now, so this ended up being pretty fun. So when they successfully got something, they got a few words. Oh boy. They got a few words that were written down. Oh, goofball. So it's right here. Most of them just got something that said, "You did it! You linked the thinger," when they succeeded. But the person that rolled a certain percentage, I had them all roll percentage, got a secret message. And this is the secret message that they got. It's kind of a riddle. It's talking about that tree that is outside. It's a sapling, and it's hidden in a place that is outside of the castle, but inside a nook. And it's an imperfect ritual, so that hopefully links their idea up to that astrology lesson, that this is a ritual that is not complete, and it's detrimental to individuals that teach defense against the dark arts, defensive kin. It's ghosting them, basically trying to turn them into ghosts by taking their essence and guiding it to the afterlife. So that's kind of why I typed that up. Everybody's really confused by it, though. Hopefully, like, as they think about it, they'll start connecting. They kind of, I think, might understand this portion, but they're a little confused by this portion. But I always have, like, if they have a riddle that they can't solve, I always make it so they can roll skill checks, and I'll give them more hints. Like, I don't want them to ever be stuck and they can't get past something, unless it's, like, really, really optional. But this is part of the story, so they could definitely roll skill checks to figure out what it meant. But they didn't have time. Like, we did have another lesson. Defense against the dark arts. Oh, yeah, okay. So I actually had 2 puzzles. Well, this was a skill challenge. This was a puzzle. And this puzzle didn't go as smoothly as I was hoping. So I don't know if you guys have ever run into the problem where, like, when your players roll a d20 and they roll low, they understand that they failed. Like, they already know they failed, and so they role play that they failed. And that's not always the case. Like, sometimes when you fail at something, you don't realize you failed. That's the case when it comes to, like, checking for traps. Most of the time you're like, oh, I did a good job at checking for traps. You don't know you did bad. So that's always hard as a dungeon master, to be like, oh, you think you did fine, and the player doesn't know how to role play that because they really know better. There are a few solutions to that I've read in, like, guides before, and one of them is inversing rolls. So, like, if a player rolls a 15 and you wanted, like, the success is a 5, and you want them to roll low, you would minus their skill point. So if they had a +3, you would minus +3 from 15, and they still wouldn't succeed, right? That would be a failure. So you basically inverse their rolls and their bonuses. That's what I tried to do here. I confused myself, and my players were confused, so I don't know if I just made it too complex. My notes were probably pretty bad on how to run it. But I still like this puzzle. It just needs to be refined. So just FYI, if you guys decide to use this. Finding the enchantment was really fun. Figuring out what the enchantment, like, quote, says was also pretty fun. I don't know if I saved... Like, this is what the enchantment actually does, but I, like, had a document that I printed out on what, like, they heard the enchanted item saying. Probably didn't save it, though, because I'm a hooligan. I printed them all out, and I cut them up, and I delivered them to the players when they got a pass or fail, so they knew what it was saying. And they had to guess at the end as a whole which ones were enchanted and which ones weren't. Anyway, after that, the rug was enchanted. It was a rug of smothering or something. It's in the combat panel. Right here, rug of smothering. So this is a challenge 2. I think they're level 2 right now. Maybe 3. So I put 2 of these rugs in there. It ended up being a pretty good fight. I really liked damage transfer. This was a really great element in the combat. I loved it. Would grapple people, and then my other players would try to hit it, and then that would do damage to their smothered person, and the person couldn't breathe, and they were suffocating. It was so great for combat. So I really liked the Rug of Smothering. It was very fun for our combat. And I think that's where we ended. They learned a few new spells. I think I had them, like, they might be able to keep the linking spell, Lego. And another spell, discovering something. I don't know. I gave them spells. I gave new spells. I made new spells for this session, which I'll probably eventually show you guys the new spells, but they're really unorganized, I'm not gonna lie. I have so many spell documents. Ugh. I should organize them during quarantine. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I will be back telling you how things went, or planning, when we get back to it, I guess.